Live now. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name's Jamie Lowe. I'm Ghungalu Djapurong man from the southwest of Victoria, CEO of the National Native Title Council, and also representative of the Eastern Maar peoples on the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, conducting the treaty process down south there. Incredibly humbled today to be in the presence of such esteemed guests who will have great dialogue and great conversation with over the next hour and a half. Before we kick off and before we kind of proceed with introductions, I want to acknowledge country. I come to you on Ngunnawal lands here in Canberra today, up here hearing the Senate inquiry being tabled to the Juukan Gorge disaster over in WA. So listening to that and in that context, heart goes out to PKKP people over there and in the Pilbara in WA. I also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all country where people are joining us today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and that will never change. I also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge all elders, both past and present, across the nations, across Australia. And we're lucky enough to be joined today on the live streaming with a number of elders within our community, which have led the way through activism and other platforms for our community. I'm just going to do some brief intros today. I'll just also give a bit of an intro of kind of the context of the webinar today. Melbourne University, ANTAR and the National Native Title Council have been collaborating around Treaty Summit earlier this year. Given the COVID circumstances, we weren't able to kind of pull that off. So we've been running a series of treaty webinars. And of course, treaty is something that our people have been asking for the best part of 200 years now. And we're finally in a position in 2020 where a number of state and jurisdictions are, embarking on that process. So it's great that we have representatives from each of those states and territories today to give their insight. I'm just going to go around the grounds and do some introductions for our esteemed guests today. And then we'll also give them the opportunity to introduce themselves and give us a bit of a kind of idea before we jump into the question time and the dialogue of kind of where their treaty processes are up to in their various states and territories. So let me kick off from the top. The Queenslanders up there, we're lucky enough to be joined today by Dr. Jackie Huggins. Dr. Jackie Huggins, AM, is a Bidjara woman from central Queensland and a Birri-Gubba woman from also from Queensland. Woman from Queensland who has worked in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs for the past 40 years. Jackie is a celebrated historian and author who has documented the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout the decades. She's the former co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, Reconciliation in Australia, and currently co-chair the Eminent personal panel of the Path to Treaty in Queensland. In 2002, Jackie received a member of the Order of Australia services Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander for her services to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community. Throughout her career, spanning over 4 decades, Jackie has played a leading role in reconciliation, literacy, women's issues, and social justice. Jackie has had a long and distinguished career in public service and her personal achievements. So, welcome, Jackie. Thanks for making the time this evening. Our next guest is Mr. Mick Gooda. Mick Gooda is a Ghungalu man from central Queensland. He advocates for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and has done for the past 30 years. His work experience includes a wide range of roles for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander one of those is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, co-commissioner of the Royal Commission into Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory, CEO of the Corporate Research Centre of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander People, and Commissioner of ATSIC. He chaired the Queensland Stolen Wages Reparations Task Force and the National Centre of Indigenous Genealogy, and has been a member of the expert panel of the Referendum Council, which were convened to advise the federal government on recognition of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia's constitution. More recently, he has been appointed Queensland's first Children and Family to the First People and Children's Family Board, which is tasked of overseeing the reforms to reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander children in child protection system, and as a First Nations advisor to the Queensland Minister of Housing on Public Works. Thanks for joining us, Mick.
Thanks, Jamie.
Our next guest is esteemed Professor Mick Dodson, AM. Professor Dodson, AM, is a highly respected Aboriginal advocate who has spent his life fighting for the rights and interests of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. Born in Katherine, Professor Dodson, AM, is a member of the Juru people, the traditional owners of the lands and waters around Broome. He's chosen as the Australian of the Year in 2009. Professor Dodson, AM, is a long-term barrister and lawyer specialising in native title and human rights. Most recently, he's been Professor of Law at the Australian National University and Director of its National Centre of Indigenous Studies. He has been a visiting academic at the University of Arizona and serves as the chair of the Australian Studies at Harvard University. Professor Dodson, AM, was counsel assisting the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, and is a former CEO of the Northern Land Council, and in 1993 was appointed the country's first Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, a post which he held in 1998. Professor Dodson, AM, has been a prominent advocate for Aboriginal land rights over the issues affecting Indigenous people within Australia and globally, and has served as the Pacific member to the United Nations Parent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thanks for coming, Mick. Our next guest, esteemed guest, is Miss Ursula Raymond. Miss Raymond is an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander woman, born and raised in the Territory, and has lived and worked where she has lived and worked most of her life. Miss Raymond has been involved in a number of major consultation projects across the NT. So there's an extensive background in media and communications and includes senior roles at the Northern Territory Land Council and the ABC, and has worked at both the federal and territory government. The key component of the Deputy Commissioner's Raymond's role would be to ensure that the culture is respected and participated and appropriated when consulting with Aboriginal women and girls across the NT, which is a critically important role. Thanks for joining us, Ursula. Our final guest today, last but by no means least, is Rueben Berg. Rueben Berg is a proud Gunditjmara man from the southwest of Victoria and currently resides in Melbourne, Victoria. He's a proud father of two young girls. Rueben tries to use his skills and enthusiasm and passion in a diverse range of areas, including Aboriginal culture, water rights, heritage, public speaking, and ultimate frisbee. Rueben is a current member of the inaugural First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which are facilitating and negotiating the treaty down there in Victoria. Thank you, Rueben, for joining us.
Yep.
So as you can see there, we've got the three kind of states and territories that are embarking on the treaty process. We've got incredible representation from all that. So we might take the opportunity now, not only to welcome our guests, but also take the opportunity to go around the grounds, find out about where your treaty process is up to in your various states and territories, and some insights to beginning for the people online. So We might go in the reverse order and move our way up to the up north. And so we might start with yourself, Rueben, if you can give us some insights on the Victorian treaty process and where it's up to. Thank you.
Sure, can do. Thanks, Jamie. And hello to everybody who's joining us here on the panel. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this panel with you all. And hello to everyone who's watching. And I also want to echo Jamie's thoughts of acknowledging the various traditional owners of the land that we're all joining as part of this conversation here today. So I am fortunate enough to be one of the members of the First Peoples Assembly here in Victoria. And it's quite a powerful thing to be a part of as part of this assembly. And we've been established under the specific piece of legislation that the Victorian government put in place, the Advancing the Treaty Process with Aboriginal Victorians Act. And that sets out the establishment of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria and some of the key things that we're trying to work on. And so in our first year, we've had a good go at trying to tackle many of those important things. And we've made some good progress against those, despite some of the challenges, obviously, we've all experienced in the last year or so. But we've been able to make some progress around how we engage with government. And so that's one of the key things we've been looking at initially is looking at the dispute resolution process. Before we can actually sit down with government, we need to have an understanding of how we're going to resolve disputes. So we've started that process of working out how we will manage any disputes that come up. And through that, the establishment will come of the Treaty Authority, which will be the entity that helps us navigate through some of those disputes that might come up. Another key pillar of what we're trying to do is around the framework. So establishing a framework for treaty, because we haven't had proper treaties here in this country. I think it's very much uncharted territory. And so the actual process for treaties is quite unclear still. And so the framework will hopefully give us a good guide around how to actually do that, which is distinct from actually having a treaty. This is just about the process for having treaties, but it's a really important first step. We've also made good progress around the Self-Determination Fund, which will support our communities in the treaty process, and also some important governance matters within our body around ensuring that we've got elders' voices appropriately represented within the work that we do, that we do have inclusion of all Victorian voices, all Aboriginal peoples represented. So that's a really important thing we've been working through, but also this critical aspect of truth-telling, which is also a really key aspect of the entire treaty process to ensure that that's grounded on truth-telling. So that's over that last year, we've been able to make progress against all those things. Still a lot of work to go. And I think important to recognise also that the work we've done as the Assembly has built on lots of work that's come before us. You know, we've just been able to grab the baton from the people before us who've done a lot of great work across the nation to get us to this spot. And we're just taking that baton and trying to do the best we can and get it to the next group who will carry it on.
Yeah, thanks, Rueben. Thanks for those insights. And of course, throughout the course of the next hour or so, we'll get some more detail from where the Victorian mob are at and their processes. So thanks for the starter and introduction there. So we might go up to the NT now. We might start with Professor Dodson, and then I'll go to you, Ursula. So Professor Dodson, if you just give us an update of where the NT process is at and maybe some insights of kind of your experience so far.
All right, look, thanks, everybody. I keep dropping out of this webinar, so I hope that doesn't happen again too soon. We've been going for almost 2 years. Our first 2 years, we did a lot of research, and we went around and talked to peak organisations primarily, to educate them about our terms of reference. And we completed a discussion paper and a report to the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory. What we're presently doing is talking to communities now. We started in October. We had, in fact, we're in Catherine to talk to the full council of the Northern Land Council tomorrow about primarily about what our discussion paper says, and the treaty model we're suggesting is a self-government model, First Nation, by First Nation to agreements between First Nations and the Northern Territory government. We've only just started the consultations. We'll run through until next October, and then we will need to give a final report to the Chief Minister. There's some key questions we've been asking people, both in the first phase, which was preparing a discussion paper and doing research and talking to pigs. But in this phase, we're really keen to firstly find out, do Aboriginal First Nations peoples want a treaty or treaties? Should there be one treaty or more than one treaty? What should go into the treaty? What might be good about a treaty? What might make things worse? And how should it be negotiated? So, like Victoria, we need to develop some sort of framework around treaties. The responses we're getting so far is that there is some support for a broad treaty, NT treaty, which would be the framework treaty, or a framework piece of legislation that enables treaties to be negotiated under that framework. And there's strong support for individual First Nations treaties, government to government, First Nations government to the Northern Territory government, and not just about service deliveries and other inconsequential thing. They want a political, or we're suggesting a political settlement, which means self-government. The trick now for us is how to negotiate the jurisdiction and what's the extent of the jurisdiction. We don't have any issues with prior ownership, prior self-government, governance, and prior sovereignty. All of those matters are conceded by the Northern Territory government, so we can get on with the job of talking about jurisdiction rather than arguing about sovereignty and whether people govern themselves and whether indeed Aboriginal people actually own the land. So they're not issues we need to confront. Urs, you might want to add a few things.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Hello, everyone. One of the other things that we've got is that the Northern Territory government has now passed legislation. So the treaty process has been enacted in legislation in the Northern Territory Parliament. So that's quite good for us. I'm also going to be working with women and young people. So we've been, as Mick said, consultations have only started recently. So we've had some community consultations, and I'm in the process of organising some Asia forums for women and also for young people, because we want to include young people in this process as well, because these negotiations take so long that they're going to be the ones probably negotiating treaties, not us. We'll probably all be somewhere else. So I'm in the process of organising those now. So I'm just waiting for women's groups to get back to me about that. And that'll be across the Northern Territory and in major centres like Darwin, Tennant Creek, Alice Springs, Catherine, out at Mullenboy, and probably over in the west as well as some smaller places. One of the other key questions that we have to consider and that we're asking people, which is also very important, is what about the stolen generations? So the stolen generations in the Northern Territory are very keen to be involved in this process, but also we've been talking to people around the Northern Territory, and there's genuine concern, and people certainly want to include them in the process as well, given the history and how people have taken, and they've all got family members. So yes, that's what we've been finding. I think people are generally pretty interested. There's a level of knowledge in some areas about the treaty, and people are very interested in it. Some have also said to us, you can't expect us to make a decision on this now. We want to have more information. We're going to suggest to the Northern Territory government that they started an education phase as well, so people are fully educated about the process and what it means really for them before any treaty negotiations take place. And we're also, you know, going down the track of a truth-telling process as well. We want it to start straight away and not wait, because there are people who are quite old now and their stories will be lost. And we were in a meeting recently in the Central Land Council out at Kintor, and there was an old man there who talked about the Constant massacre. You know, he had memories of that. So we want to make sure these people's stories are heard and involved in this truth-telling process as well. For us, our mob, but also for the rest of Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Dodson and Ursula. Some great insights there of where you're up to with the treaty processes there, and I think probably a recurring theme throughout today's conversation will be around representation. So it's really great to hear that you have taken on a special role there, Ursula, in making sure that women and young people are actually involved in these processes, and I guess other parts of our kind of marginalised kind of communities, stolen generation, etc., that they get a voice within these processes as well. It's critical. And I know that the Victorian mob have examined what this looks like, and I know even in the formation of the Assembly, there was an equality quota where, you know, it was at least 50% of women would be voted on to the Assembly. And lucky enough, we didn't actually need to use that quota. It was, that over 50% of women actually got voted on, so it shows that our mob's quite a diverse and, you know, representative of different genders. So great to hear from where you're up to. I'll just as we kind of step through it, I just had a few messages in the thing there. Just make sure people are kind of close to their mic, and so that people can kind of hear them clearly. So yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate it. So might flip it over to now Jackie, and just hear about where the Queensland mob are up to, and get your insights.
Yep, sure. Well, we're the latest cabs off the rank. Yeah, we are the latest cabs off the rank, black and white, whatever you want to call it, yellow, Jaffas, you know. That's a joke, folks, all right? I wouldn't make this up. We need a bit of Murray humor here.
Lighten it up.
Yeah, lighten it up. It's a real
Must be
serious
one only Queenslanders can get.
Well, anyway, we started off our process. It was last NAIDOC week, not last, but, you know, 2019. And we were, so we went out to consultation. We did our process a bit different though. We used it as a process for all Queenslanders. So we talked to everyone who wanted to come to the consultation meetings. So they came, they listened, they heard, probably over 1,500 people, and people from community organisations from a whole array of places. Mick and I were the co-chairs of the Treaty Working Group, and we also members of the Eminent panel that was oversighting the whole process. And you know, we had people on there like Dame Quentin Bryce, always been a treaty girl, as she says. We had Birri O'Brien, because of his public profile, Michael Lavarch, and other people, okay? So that Eminent panel worked together with Treaty Working Group, and Mick and I were the conduits, I suppose, in terms of relaying information and so forth. They all came out on consultations with us, which was really good. And we went to a number of locations, maybe 40 across the state in the time we had. Then on the 8th of February this year, we handed in our report, which talked about recommendations for the Queensland government to consider. And then COVID hit after that. So unfortunately, we weren't able to get around again in terms of, you know, the process of telling people, you know, what was actually in the report. But of course now, with there are a lot of online processes and processes by which, you know, you could view the report and so forth. You know, we still think that needs to happen, and of course that will. Now, in the meantime, we've had a Queensland government election here, which unfortunately we lost our champion in the Minister, Jackie Trad. who had championed the treaty process in Queensland. And we owe her great recognition and debt for that. So we now have a new Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, very committed, as well, Honourable Craig Crawford from Cairns, and we hope that that will continue. In fact, they have Queensland Government, as I know, is quite committed to the process and will continue that for us because they got in at the last election, as we know. It may have been a different story like we've seen in South Australia with the treaty process. Unfortunately, it didn't happen here, and we look forward to a continuation of that support. Look, everywhere we went, there was broad support for the treaty process. People wanted to be known loud and clear that sovereignty was never ceded in our country, and that treaties should be most definitely legal binding processes and should have a human rights framework. Truth-telling, very common themes, truth-telling was the absolute and non-negotiable in all our discussions. And of course, the need for a broad public awareness program to, bring the other 97% of our population in. But really, for this to be in the hands of our people, to really, be community-led and driven. And of course, we look to Victoria and Northern Territory processes to see what was happening there, and very informed by those, as we did with international models as well, particularly New Zealand and British Columbia. So we've got a lot of very common themes here that we talk about in our whole nationwide treaty process. Just quickly, some of the recommendations was that we're looking at establishing a First Nations Treaty Institute that will be an independent body, as was the panel, and for us to forward the path to treaty process. Truth-telling, facilitation of that, truth-telling and healing, and the capacity building for our people to actively participate in this process. There's also, we need to have that deep understanding of the wider Queensland community in terms of what we are doing. And we want the resourcing, people. We really want the resourcing and the establishment of a First Nations Treaty Future Fund as well. Not sure how that's going to fly, but we'll certainly give it a go. And look, I'm very impressed at the moment with what the Victorian government has come to the fore in terms of providing that resource for Victorians. So that's good. And there was a bill that was placed before Parliament to further the path to treaty process and to establish the First Nations Treaty Institute and that future fund. So look, I'm going to hand over to Mick now to talk further on those deliberations that we had and where we're at the moment. Thanks, Mick.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. And maybe a question to Mick also to elaborate on the kind of, I guess now with the Labor government getting voted in, I think it was only maybe last month or the month before, end of October, you've got probably some clear air now for the next 4 years. So maybe my question, and I'll give you an insights as well around kind of what's next for the mob up there in Queensland, and I guess what has there been some discussions about what you're hoping to achieve within that kind of the next term? I think you're on mute.
Thanks, Jamie. Can I just acknowledge you and Rueben, younger people coming through? There's us oldies here getting worn out, but Jesus, great to have you two guys involved in this discussion today.
You're suggesting I'm old, Michael.
Not out.
I'm getting there. I'm working my way towards that. But look, one of the things that came up constantly in our consultations was We were heading into an election. We had really tight timeframes. We were hoping to get legislation through before the election. And of course, like Jackie said, and we all realised, COVID hit and just threw everything out of kilter. And we had to reduce some of our ambitions for this year at least. One of the main things I talked about was how do you future-proof this if in the event that there was going to be a change of government in this year's election. So that's gone away now. We're now entering our first 4-year term in Queensland with fixed election dates. So we know when the next election is going to be held. We know what time is in front of us. Just before the election, the Premier tabled our report in Parliament. She wanted to do that to show the commitment of the Queensland Labor government to treaty rather than just have a press release and put it out there. But I'll just go back on a couple of things. One is we talk about truth telling and it became apparent, and when you think about it, it's a no-brainer and it's just intuitive that you can't have a treaty unless it's based on the truth. And you've got to actually tell the truth. And we're like Victoria and I think the Northern Territory will go around truth telling. And we did a fair bit of work on that, looking at what sort of structure it would be. And we're thinking a Royal Commission type approach where you could use, the powers of a Royal Commission to force people to come and give evidence or written, because we all know once we get into this, it's going to be a really bit of, if I can say, ass-covering exercise by lots of government departments, and even a lot of businesses around the place don't want the truth out there about what happened during their time. I'm thinking the telegraph stations around the place and how that affected all of us. So that was really important that we get that right in front, that truth telling. You cannot have a treaty unless it's based on the truth. And we've got to tell the truth, like Ursula said, it's not just for our mob, but it's actually for the whole population to be able to move forward to hear the truths. And Ursula, I really talk about the Coniston massacre, and when the handover came for Coniston Station a couple of years ago, the granddaughter of the policeman who led those things was invited up to celebrate with the mob about the handover. That's real. That's truth telling, and that's everyone walking away from it with that sort of business settled. I think right up front we asked people, do you want a treaty? Overwhelmingly, people want a treaty, but it was pretty. They were pretty cynical that we've been down this track many times, and governments had promised lots of things, and we haven't got it. So I guess that thing is like. The words I use is, people are cynical and fatigued from this stuff. So we've got to be really certain that if we're going to go down this track, this is the best opportunity we've got with this government in place. Jamie asked what the plans are for this government. Well, we just got to keep the pedal to the metal, really. And I know people in the Northern Territory are used to this, but we now have 3 Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in Parliament: Leanne Enoch, Lance McCullum, and of course Cynthia Louie, our first Torres Strait Islander woman in the Queensland Parliament. So we know that they're working away inside to keep, the finger in the back of government, keep on pushing them forward. But some of the issues I think we've got to, we talked about people being treaty ready. How do we actually get people ready for a treaty? Because I think Mick raised it at the beginning. Are we going to have lots of treaties or one treaty? I think the answer for me is pretty simple. There's going to be lots of treaties. And to me, it's really from a practical position that who signs it for us? Who signs a treaty for us? If we don't agree on anything in our mob, let alone someone signing a treaty for us on one side. So one side you'd probably have the governor and the premier signing it, then the other side 250,000 signatures from all of us trying to work that out. So I think, I don't want to joke about that, but to me that drove my thinking a little bit about who would actually sign it for us. One of the big challenges we have in Queensland, I dare say it's the same right across Victoria and the NT, to a lesser extent NT, but where I come from in Rockhampton, where I grew up, that's not my country. My country is about 2 hours, 2 and a bit hours west of Rockhampton, around where Rueben Berg is. It's Dharawal country, but there's at least 30 other nations live in Rockhampton. If we're going to have a treaty and it's going to be based around traditional owners, where does that leave those other nations that live there and have grown up? Like my family's been there for about 3 generations now in Rockhampton, but we're not traditional owners. So that's what we sort of talk about. Lots of discussions got to happen within our communities before we get to be treaty ready. And that's why we came up with the concept of the Treaty Institute that would do all that backgrounding work, that would start using the evidence that Mick's really familiar with self-government, the stuff we've done on things out of Harvard, that Harvard project on self-government. How do we actually use the evidence that we've got to build this place where our mob are going to be treaty ready? Jamie, I really think that's going to be the challenge for us in the coming years. And like Jackie said, we've got to really push the government for this commitment now that it just can't be a one-off thing and goes out of fashion next year and we all go our separate ways again. So, mate, I'll leave it at that because I know you've got a lot of questions and I'm looking forward to getting into some of that.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot of questions in there and a few answers. And I guess one of the things that I always say within these discussions, sometimes they almost raise more questions than answers throughout this because we're kind of, just kind of feeling our way through it. Absolutely. I just want to kind of touch on a couple of your highlights there. I think both Mick and Jackie, and particularly one of the last ones there, Mick, around kind of who's going to negotiate treaty or who's going to kind of be the mob. Is it going to be, a whole heap of treaties within the various states and territories? This is going to be one statewide treaty. And I know through our Victorian processes, it was only, I think it was back in either June or July, there was close to a unanimous vote within our chamber that there'd be a variation of both. There'd be multiple treaties with First Nations groups and also a statewide treaty. So we thought going through that process, you could probably get almost the best of both worlds with those kind of those negotiations, because I guess some of the things that an individual treaty wouldn't be able to negotiate, maybe a state body could negotiate, those broader kind of legislation type, bigger picture type things. And I guess one of the questions that we'll grapple with, and I'm interested to hear this and because getting to the question now, and I might pass it over to Professor Dodson on who gets to negotiate treaty. And I know that you'll be grappling that within the NT, and I just noticed in your bio there that you're a Juru man from the Kimberley, was born in Catherine, of course, which many of us were born off country because for various different circumstances. So I'm interested to know kind of where kind of NT's at in that conversation around who gets to negotiate treaty.
Yeah, well, one of the key things that Mick mentioned is treaty ready. There's no one in Northern Territory at the moment who's treaty ready. No First Nations government, because there aren't any, and not the Northern Territory government. They're not ready to negotiate a treaty either. There are some standout First Nations that might be able to do it quicker than others, but we're suggesting a time frame of 20 to 25 years per treaty. That means you wouldn't be doing one treaty at a time. You do treaties together, get many on the table as quickly as you can. But it's a long game. That's what we're telling people. We're saying what we're suggesting is that there be a framework based on two things: the Van Boven principles of the United Nations for how you deliver reparations and compensation, and other matters for victims of gross violations of human rights. And the Australian Human Rights Commission has already found that stolen generations is a gross violation of human rights, and of course the massacre of people is clearly a violation of people's human rights. We're also saying that the framework for what we call the Umbrella Treaty should be based on the fundamental freedoms and rights contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they ought to be the minimum rights. Nothing should go below that. We propose or suggest an interim treaty commission. We might call it something else, but there'd be a new commission after our work's finished in March 2022. An interim commission takes over. Its job is to develop the framework legislation that frames the way in which treaties are done at a local or regional basis. Once that drafting is done by that interim commission, and it may be made up of, well, it have an Aboriginal majority, but other non-Aboriginal Territorians as well with relevant expertise. Once that draft is available, there'd be a territory-wide convention that signs off on the legislation before it gets passed by the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly. And then their job is finished once the territory-wide convention signs off on it. The Permanent Treaty Commission is established and takes over, and that's an all Aboriginal membership of that, probably 5 to 7 treaty commissioners. And part of their main job is to police the process, make sure everybody's following the rules, but also may have a role in helping both government and First Nations government and the territory government getting ready to conduct treaties. We're saying to people it's going to take time because you need to get ready yourself, including getting your negotiators ready, who some of them now might be 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. They'll be your negotiators, and they'll probably be, as adults in their 30s or early 40s, the people who sign your treaties. Because anybody who's in their 70s like me won't be around in 25 years when the first treaty gets signed. In terms of First Nations and its membership, that primarily is a matter of self-determination, is their decision as to who is a citizen of their First Nation. So First Nations are territorially bound. A lot of people have moved into places like Darwin and Catherine, some of them forced in, Darwin, Catherine, Tennant Creek, Alice Springs, who don't come from there. Many of them know where they come from. Many of them accepted back, some aren't. Some don't know. We don't know how we deal with that problem, but the primary focus is on First Nations and the membership of First Nations, which extrapolates in the Northern Territory. Either they're the native title holders or they're the traditional owners under the Northern Territory Land Rights Act. And what do you do about people who've got big white enclaves on their territory, like the Latakia in Darwin? How do they do a treaty? How can they exercise self-government? We think that what could happen in those circumstances would only be constrained by a lack of imagination. Patience, commitment, determination has to be sustained. We'd welcome any suggestions from other places about that process and that approach. One of the things we will be doing before Christmas, and this harks back to something we were discussing earlier, we'll be releasing a discussion paper on truth-telling, or dealing with the unfinished business, as we say up here. So we'll get that out, and hopefully people will have a look at it and shoot at it, give us some positive feedback. That'd be helpful, but we don't know how to do it. We're making suggestions. And finally, before I shut up, one of the things that's vital and it's a problem Australia-wide, disunity for First Nations groups, or between First Nations groups, is going to be deadly, a deadly weapon to kill treaties. And that's part of getting ready, is to get your unity together, get your people together. Because if you're arguing or you've got disputes within your mob or with the mob next door, you're never going to get to the treaty table. That's the key part of being treaty ready, is being unified. And the other thing is, we were out last week. We spent 10 days out in Eastern Arnhem Land. The Yulnu people, I mean, they squabble as much as anybody around the country. But, they've got 62 separate, distinct clans connected to separate, distinct pieces of country. How would you govern that? You can't. It wouldn't make sense to have 62 clan-based treaties. But they understand what federation is and how a federation might work for them. One government, but a federated government. We've had other people saying, oh, well, look, we're First Nations, that mob over there and that mob over there. We do a lot of business together, and we've been doing that for thousands of years. Maybe we could have a federation of those three different First Nations. So we've got one government. Mm-hmm. And other ways of dealing with internal division and division between First Nations is internal First Nations treaties, saying, all right, we'll have a treaty to agree where our boundary is and where your boundary is. So we will sort that out before we go and negotiate our own treaties. And what the experience in British Columbia, there's so much you have to do before you even get to the treaty table. You've got to tie up loose ends all over the place. And you've got to take over stuff that whitefellow government's been doing, because that's what governments do. They deliver services, but they're also a political entity. So I don't know if Ursula wants to add anything, but I'm hogging all the time here, sorry.
There's fantastic insights there, and I think the biggest take out of that, it's extremely complex. And you speak of the Yolngu people having over 60 different distinct base clans, like that within itself is extremely complex. And who represents, who negotiates treaty. I know Rueben, that's something that Victoria is kind of grappling with, and they're in amongst it right now. And even in the election process of forming the assembly, we grappled with those, I guess, questions. Can you give us some insights of how kind of Victoria kind of did sort it out and are sorting it out as we speak?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's still an ongoing process, as lots of these things are going to be, to kind of ensure that we can be inclusive as possible as an entity. And so the way that we were established as the assembly was that all the groups that already had formal recognition by the state, so whether they were recognised as with native title or under the Traditional Owner Settlement Act or as a registered Aboriginal party here in Victoria, all those groups that we've got, so there is 11 of those at the moment, and they cover, in terms of land mass, they cover about 74% of the state. All those 11 groups were given a seat at the table, one of the seats on the assembly. And 10 of those have taken that seat up. And then to kind of find a balance within that, there was an election process across 5 different regions to elect other people to come and be a part of the assembly. And that's how we got our chamber of 31 through that combination of directly appointed from their groups and also elected from those regions. But obviously 74% is not the whole state. We've actually got a guaranteed representative on that. And whilst many of our members might have connections to the various nations across and the clans across our state, they're not there as a formal representative of those peoples. And so we still have that gap that we're trying to work out how to do that. But as well, all of us who are involved in this space know it's not an easy way of just saying, well, this group here, they claim that that's their land, so we'll make them one of the groups, because there's another group next door who say actually that's their land and they represent that group. And so there's conversations we're going to have around how we do that. And from my perspective, one of the challenges is how do we propose a way that we can do that better than the other systems already in place are doing that? Because there's lots of groups trying to do this already, and they've had 10 or so years to try and put this in place and haven't had a success yet on those areas. They've had success across 74%, but this last bit is sometimes that's not been appointed yet because there's significant challenges there. So how are we going to be best placed to come up with a way of resolving that, I think is really important. And that's only one step then. To be included on our assembly is one step towards the treaty process, because then there's a whole nother process then left to actually sit down with government and say, well, who do they think should be sitting at the table? Because we do need to have a negotiation about these things. I think it would be great if we could just decide who was going to do it and we had the full control over that. But I don't think that's how negotiations work. You have to sit down and have discussions, and that's going to be an interesting part of the process to see where the government's at in terms of who they want to have sitting at the table. And I think one of the things I'm really, and the rest of the assembly I think is really keen on, is working out how we can have that strength and conviction and confidence in what we're doing to say, well, no, we think we've got what's the right process, and we're the experts in this area, and hopefully we can put through some convincing arguments to get the right people at the table so that we can have both that statewide treaty. And I think the statewide treaty is really important because it helps with some of the things that other people have mentioned about people not living on country necessarily, about stolen generations. Statewide treaties have a chance to deliver benefits to those people. And then the local treaties, that when we identify the right groups, they deliver the benefits to their local, to those specific clans or nations. So it's a really tough road to travel along. And I think whatever process we get to, not everyone's going to be happy. But from my standpoint, in terms of self-determination, at the very least, the decision that will be made will have been led by Aboriginal people. It's not going to be some outside agent telling us how we have to do it. We're going to be the ones sitting at the table, being a part of that decision. And that's really important. Even if everyone doesn't agree with it in the end, we were sitting at the table making those decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Rueben. I was going to pick up on one of your comments. We've, I guess, sitting at the table, around the treaty table at the moment, we've identified, I guess, some of the inadequacies or some of the issues that are from previous kind of legislation. And one of the questions in the chat box here was around kind of what are our learnings from other kind of land-based regimes, i.e. Northern Territory Lands Act, New South Wales Lands Act, native title. So maybe I was going to throw it to the floor, and maybe we could go to the Queenslanders up there, either Mick or Jackie. What have been our learnings from your sites and your experience, given your decades of experience? And, we've all had bad experiences, I guess, and long processes through the native title process. What are your kind of insights there? I guess, what have we learned, lessons learned, I guess, from, what we've done before? Maybe Mick.
Okay, Jamie, look, it's like I spent a fair bit of time in WA, Northern Territory, and people in those states self-identify. There's Juru, there's Matu, there's Yamachi, there's us on the eastern seaboard, including people down in Melbourne. We had those collective terms, Koori, Guri, Murray, So we were collectivised by those words. And when I come back, I actually see now where I don't hear the word Murray too much in Queensland. I don't hear the word Koori too much in New South Wales. I'm Wiradjuri, I'm Ewan, I'm Dunghutti, I'm whatever. And we're slowly on the eastern seaboard claiming that identity back. I'm Ghungalu on my dad's mum's side, I'm Yemen on my mum's side, dad's side, So we're identifying like that, and particularly younger people coming through. Mick was saying 15-year-olds today might be the ones negotiating these treaties in 20 years, 30 years' time. So I think we're reclaiming that stuff. We're at the beginning of this in Queensland. I can talk about that. This dispersal that happened at colonisation, where our mum got sent all over. Now we got to deal with that. And that example I gave you of Rockhampton, where there's Darrabul people who are the traditional owners, yet there's about 30 other nations that have grown up there. How do we deal with that? And Rueben said there's going to be disagreements, but the beauty of a treaty, you can only go forward when there is agreement. So it's not a treaty if we force it on one side, even amongst ourselves. If one group of people force it on another group of people or other groups of people, that's not going to be a treaty. That's not a treaty. It can't be a treaty. So this time we have to take to get there. I agree with Mick's time frame. It's a long time frame they're there, and I saw Les Mel's comments. Maybe we need to actually put staged approaches in when we get to a certain stage, like a treaty commission, for instance, that sets the parameters of treaties and how they're going to be negotiated is really important. But I go back to thinking about how we can actually, it's going to take time, but think about that. It can't be a treaty if there's disagreement. We've got to work at this till we get to a point of, and I think the best way to do that, we've done it for 60,000 years in this country, is reaching consensus and just keep working away till we actually get that consensus. On the other side of this equation, we also in Queensland talk about government getting treaty ready. Now, they've got a hard enough stuff of their own to actually start getting treaty ready, because you name every department I can think of will be affected by a treaty in any particular part of Queensland. So we've got to get them ready. We know they weren't ready for native title and they're still grappling with native title. We actually got to get government. That's why I think we've got to use this 4 years to set the framework in place with this government we've got here now. They're there, they've got an increased majority, so there's not much chance of them failing in the next 4 years. What we've got to do is push so hard in this 4 years to set the framework going forward about how we get treaty ready.
Yeah, Jackie, did you have any insights on that? What are the lessons learned from the native title process that you've seen?
Yeah, well, certainly to concur with Mick, we actually, I don't believe we've got the most sophisticated native title processes in our state. I mean, there are states, we're all pretty diverse. There are states that are much more forward-looking and forward-thinking and doing great stuff, such as UMOB in Victoria, where you have a fairly distinct kind of representational model within your community. I don't believe that's here. I don't believe that's here in Queensland. In fact, that's why we're setting up this First Nations Treaty Institute. Have a look at all those things that we're going to be confronted with in our deliberations and our processes of doing that. And certainly, representation is a very big thing. And we're not proposing that we're going to set up, as Victoria has done, just yet, a First Nations Assembly, because we believe that there's a lot of work here in Queensland to be done around that. So that is why we're investing, the independent body, the Treaty Institute, to look at those things, to look at how we can be represented by the native title determinations. What are the native title claims that are pending and that might go through? Should all this even include? Of course, it should include big bodies and organisations, and should the elections have a nomination process? It's all down to the fine detail of which we hope the Treaty Institute can actually look at for us, because we don't have all the answers. We're all very new at this, particularly here, and our history of this state. I mean, we've written a very powerful chapter about some of the very truth-telling aspects that we need to tell within our report, and I invite everybody to have a look at that. We don't hold back. We don't hold back. We talk about the murders, the massacres, the rapes of our women, and it continues. And we've got to say that stuff, all the unpalatables of our history. So there are many things that we're going to invest and really let the Institute facilitate. And we're right. I saw a comment in the chats around don't let the government rush. And we're not letting that. We've got to get this stuff as right as we can. So, so hopefully, we'll be looking at that in a deeper and a wider way.
I had a quick answer for you, Jamie, as well, if you want.
Go for it.
I think an important lesson from here in Victoria around some of the previous agreements that have been put in place, Native Title, Traditional Owner Settlement Act, is water. Like, we've got to make sure that we've got proper water rights for our people here in Victoria, and I think across the nation, that we can't just have water and land being separated like it has been. We've got to get water rights as part of this, and I think treaty is a way to help achieve that.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Rueben. I just wanted to kind of go back to one of Jackie's points around kind of process, something that we're grappling with in the state of Victoria. I guess one of the good things is that we have these set election dates, as Uncle Mick said up there. In Queensland, they've got a 4-year clear run, and we've got a date that we're got, penciled, or not penciled in, texted in permanent marker. I think it's November 2022. There's a debate around how quick do you move, how slow do you want to move? Don't rush it. So I'm just kind of interested to kind of hear around kind of, and even Professor Dodson spoke about, these treaties are going to be a long-term thing, and they're going to take a long time to negotiate. So we've got some insights around process and how long should treaties take to negotiate, as long as they take, or is that a learning from the native title process where it takes decades and our elders die within the process of actually not even getting a determination with native title? So be interesting to hear some insights of kind of how quick should we move in these treaty processes.
Jamie, can I just say one really quick thing about native title?
Yep.
Why we think it's so difficult is we're the first generation to deal with native title. And if you go and look at, and Mick knows about this better than I do, like 1975, the Land Rights Act comes in the Northern Territory. They thought the world was going to end up there. A couple of generations later, it's so embedded in the way of life in the Northern Territory, the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, that no one would ever consider going to the Northern Territory doing anything without working with Aboriginal people up there through the Land Council system. And what we're going, I went back and looked at this, all the comments from our mob and others about this land rights is going to destroy us and tear us apart and whatever. There's lots of fear going around both in the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal community. But look where we are now. So I think we've got to get a bit of perspective here when we talk about the time it takes to do this. We're the first generation right now having to deal with native title, a whole new form of law in this country. And it's going to take some time for that to settle. And of course, we're going to have bumps and grinds and everything along the way. But I still have so much faith in our mob that if we actually work on consensus and what we need to do, we can actually get that agreement. We've done it for 60,000 years, like I said before, that we can actually get to that. But like Mick said, we've got to respect each other and we've got to get through that point. And sometimes we're dealing with the effects of colonisation, with lateral violence and you name it. We've got to get our mob back together. And again, that's what Jackie talked about. We talk about in Queensland, healing. This has got to be a healing process for all of us. Get us back together, deal with native title because it's here to stay. The one thing we all agree on, it's here to stay. It's not going away. I've said it a few times, think about us as the first generation to have to deal with it. Hopefully down the track in 30 years' time, it'll be just a normal part of business right across Australia rather than what we're going through right now. So I think treaty will be the same. I think we've just got to come along with it and be committed. I know that sounds a bit Pollyanna, but I can't, if you agree with what I said before, we wrote about this, it can only be by agreement and consent of everyone to have a treaty. We've got to work at that.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. Almost philosophical there, I think, with your response. But yeah, you're right. We are the first generation of kind of dealing with native title and other kind of legislative-based regimes, and hopefully the next generation, you know, we've cleared a bit of a path for our younger people. Absolutely. And I guess you know, in other states and jurisdictions, like it hasn't been even though we're embarking on the first kind of treaty processes, there has been some major agreements take place within Australia, within the nation already under, you know, whether it be land rights regimes, native title regimes and other. One of the questions, we've got a bit of an all-star kind of conversation going here in the chat box as well by some of the people that are popping up there. So, you know, say hello to all the people that are joining us, all the mob and their experiences. Maybe to Professor Dodson, there was a question in the chat box here around the Noongar agreement, and I guess looking from afar, people from you know the East Coast and other jurisdictions, there's been commentary around it being treaty-like. Have you had a chance to examine the kind of the Noongar agreement, which I crossed a pretty significant threshold in recent weeks? And about what kind of treaty-like elements does it have, and kind of, I guess, what other things that could a treaty kind of deliver that the Noongar agreement maybe didn't?
Yeah, I agree. It's treaty-like. The British Columbian model, the Noongar settlement came about as a result of a settlement of native title. All the new modern treaties in British Columbia are settlements of native title. What distinguishes a treaty, in my view, from some ordinary agreement or other form of settlement, you know, be it a contract to deliver services or a settlement about the stolen generations, whatever. Treaties are different because they're all of those things, but they're also a political settlement. And they have to be a political settlement. And they have to deliver to First Peoples the right to self-government. Their right to choose self-government if they so wish. You know, people don't have to choose self-government as part of a treaty settlement. But in my view, if there's no political settlement, there's no treaty. It's just an ordinary agreement about how you might use land or control access or build roads on it or to dig it up or to build houses on it or to install shipping facilities or whatever. You know. The treaty is distinguishable by the fact that it's also a political settlement. And it's never a final settlement. Don't ever agree to what the white fellas like, what they call full and final settlements. The Western Australian government forced that upon us in Broome. This is full and final settlement. Nobody, including white fellow governments, have got the right to tie this generation to future generations, or we've got no right to say to future generations, this is full and final, you can't have anything better than this. That's simply wrong, and it's probably a breach of future generations' right to choose, their right to self-determination, because they may want to do things differently. So treaties also have to be flexible. They have to be living documents that are capable of change. And if they're not, the whole process withers away and dies, you know, because it can't adapt to new changing circumstances because it's set in the past because some white fellow bureaucrat or politician said, we've had enough of this, we want to settle this forever. Well, nothing in human relationships or political relationships are settled forever. each generation takes on the next challenge as they emerge. And we've got no right to tie their hands.
Yeah, I think that's incredible insights there around the distinction of agreements or settlements and treaty, and I have to 100% agree. Were there any other insights in regard to kind of, I guess, general agreements or settlements versus kind of treaty settlements and the distinction of them both?
Do you want me to add something?
No.
Addressing that generally?
Yeah, addressing it generally. I think so. We've got about 10 minutes to go. One of the questions that I wanted to ask the panel is that we're all in our various locations negotiating with states or territory, and I guess the glaring kind of obvious kind of omission there is the Commonwealth. Where do you kind of see the Commonwealth kind of, or when do you see the Commonwealth starting to kind of have the treaty conversation, and maybe kind of pass it to Rueben?
Yeah, I mean that is the really important question to be asking. That we here in Victoria, we're mindful that we're responsible for working out what is happening here in Victoria, but nationally that's a much bigger conversation. And it seems that at the moment the current government is not interested in it in the same way that the various states and territories that we're all representing here. They've, especially in Victoria, they've shown an extreme willingness to want to go down this path, which we don't see echoed at the moment at that national level. But I don't think that means that we should sit back and just wait for something to happen at a national level. I think that we can start to do the work that we are doing. And I know that here in Victoria, we've got a particular focus and recognising that what we're trying to achieve is whatever the Victorian government has the power to achieve for our people, that's what we're going to be striving to make sure is on the table as part of our discussions, realising that at that national level, it will take a national treaty. But hopefully, if we can do things right and show, I think the really important thing here is if we can show for non-Aboriginal people the value of the treaty process, the importance of it for Aboriginal people, but also the importance of it for all people here in Australia, that will hopefully lead to an ability to kind of get that shift at the national level, that we get that buy-in from the entire Australian community that, yes, we need to have a treaty, and that voice is just so strong that it can't be denied at that national level. But that takes us doing the right things in the state and continuing to press for things to change at that national level as well. But it needs, I think, to bring everyone along as part of that conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Rueben. Jackie, any insights there?
Well, clearly at the national level, nothing is going to happen treaty-wise. I think that's pretty clear. When we embarked upon our process here in Queensland, we were distinctly told that the Minister Ken White would leave it up to the states and territories to determine our own fates in relation to the treaty. So what is that saying? Are they being supportive? Are they watching? Or are they looking at us to even fail in our processes? I mean, we've got to be really fair dinkum around this. And, the tension, of course, between the state now, our states here in Queensland have Labor government, and Victoria, other places, and not playing in that national space is look. I agree with Rueben. We just got to go with it. We've got to get the best that we can out of our jurisdictions to be able to, put our recommendations and our plans forward to, the wider national and hopefully, international perspectives as well. But, it is what it is. We're stuck with it in a good way, I think. And it gives us that space to really consult, but also talk about, those negotiate rather our our local and state issues, which have been neglected for so long in relation to a treaty. Even the idea of treaty. I know that you know, this has been on the table for generations even. Now, as Mick said, you know, we're picking up the baton now, you know, but to be ready to hand on to, younger mob who are coming through. And believe me, that's happening. That's happening all over this country in terms of the mentorship and in terms of the information and knowledge that we are passing down and bringing that mob together with us. All I want to say, thanks.
Thanks, Jackie, for those insights. Were there any? We've got about 5 minutes to go. I'm going to give.
Could I just mention
go
the
for it.
special difficulties we have with the Commonwealth in the Northern Territory? I've got some legal advice on this, and you're welcome to have it. You can even find it on our website, I think, but let me know if you can't. But there's particular constitutional legal issues for the Northern Territory making treaties because of the federal constitution and the federal government's lawmaking power, particularly 122 of the constitution, which really gives them carte blanche to do whatever they please at their whim. They don't need to consult the people of the Northern Territory. They don't need to talk to the Northern Territory government. They can just come in and do what they like. And that's virtually what they did with the youth detention thing, Mick, but also the intervention and other things. You know, they have the power to do it. And if we set up a system of treaty making, they can knock it over at whim. So we're more vulnerable than the states, because they pause a bit when it comes to the states, because the states have their own plenary powers. What we do know in the Northern Territory is a number of things. One thing we know for sure is what governments across the country are doing and have been doing for 234 years does not work for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They have failed us, and I don't think there's any other argument that can be put by them. We do know from our research and what's happened on the ground that where at the basis level, it's an exercise of self-determination, but where people have control over those decisions on the things that most affect their lives, their daily lives, they do a far better bloody job than government ever will do if they control those decisions. And thirdly, the job of the Commonwealth is not to oppose treaty making, but to facilitate it. And as a responsible federal government, they ought to be setting the ground rules for treaty makings at the state and territory level. They should set the standards that I mentioned earlier, those two international instruments, the Van Woven Principles and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and say to the states and territories, these are the rules, these are the standards, you guys go for it. Don't go below those standards or we'll ping you. So it's very important that we take our time and get it right. Because if we get it right, who in their right mind would want to undo it? Because what they're doing doesn't work. Why would we go back to that? Because what we suggest, and if we're given the go-ahead to do it, we're going to make things better for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And why the hell would you want to undo that?
I think that's a pretty powerful note to end on, Professor Mick Dodson there, and I think that that the international instruments, I think it's key. I know the Victorian mob are using that as a platform to negotiate our treaties and create our framework. We've got 2 minutes to go. I'd just like to take the last 2 minutes of thanking everyone to kind of joining us this evening. It's been some great insights. It's going to be a conversation that, of course, continues, but through ANTAR, NNTC, and also Melbourne Uni, we'll continue these webinars to bring the voice to the mob. You know, the free events so people can join in, continue the dialogue. And we're hopeful to culminate this conversation in a summit in 2021, where the mob can come together and hopefully not only learn from each other's processes and what's gone before us and what we need to do next, but I think the Commonwealth government, we need to be able to call them out and bring them to the table. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks everyone for joining us again. It's been some great discussions in the box. Hope to see you again soon. Hopefully next time face to face, given that we can visit New Queensland mob now and NT and WA mob. So us Victorians will be out and about now. So hopefully you can see us again, and everyone enjoy their Christmas and holiday period. Thanks everyone. Stay safe.